Hello, everyone, and welcome to OMFIF's inaugural AI and Finance Seminar, which is being co-run this year with the University of Oxford's AI Governance Initiative. This event is the first in-person event in a series that we will be running on artificial intelligence's safety and governance considerations, with a particular focus on the financial sector. Now, before I begin, I want to share a few brief comments on why we are looking at AI applications and risk in the financial sector. For starters, there's perhaps never been a more interesting time to study artificial intelligence. The boom in AI activity, a boom kindled by the launch of large language models, has ushered in unprecedented investment and interest in artificial intelligence. Indeed, after decades where progress in AI seemed to stagnate, it appeared that we had now reached a new frontier where artificial intelligence advancement would be felt more widely, promoting efficiency gains across industries and helping spur badly needed productivity growth. And so after the entrance of OpenAI's ChatGPT into the public consciousness, it seemed the race was on. We have started to see competitor LLMs from other dominant firms, and this includes Anthropic and DeepMind, and we've seen use cases and capacity of these tools increase, and so too did the interest in understanding relevant safety and government considerations. The United Kingdom in particular has been a leader in the emerging calls for AI safety and governance, and this manifested most notably in the UK's AI Summit in Bletchley Park. For the first time, it seemed that the international system was taking seriously such concerns related to catastrophic risk, frontier models, biological warfare, cybersecurity, and inequality. But despite the sense that we had reached a new frontier of AI development, to much of the financial sector, some of this was nothing new. After all, finance has been using AI for decades to automate or improve many key functions, and that includes personalized services and products, risk management, compliance, data optimization, and, of course, algorithmic trading. In fact, a study in 2019 showed that around 92% of trading in the foreign exchange market was performed by algorithms as opposed to humans. The purpose of today's event, then, is therefore twofold. We want to better understand how AI is being used today. To what extent is the current AI boom ushering in more of the same? To what extent is it ushering in new tools? And furthermore, we've seen significant early attempts to regulate and develop safety parameters to deal with AI risks, broadly speaking. To what extent do we see similar such risks in the financial sector? What would it look like for governments to help institute AI safety protocols? So in today's event, we will hear from major AI stakeholders in both the UK government as well as major technology companies. And in today's two panels, we will begin with a discussion from speakers before turning to audience questions, and we invite your active participation in this event. And I'd like to remind everyone that this is an event that's going to be recorded and therefore on the record. So with that, I'm very excited to welcome our first panel. And here we have Paolo Valenziano, who is the head of content delivery at the Bank of England. We're also joined by Mario Pisani, who is the Deputy Director of Financial Stability at the UK Treasury. And finally, we're joined by Stephen Barr, who is the Director for Worldwide Government at Microsoft. So I want to start now with a general question to open things up, which is, Steve, starting with you, when you look at AI development in the last year, what do you see?
Is there anything else but AI going on in the world at the moment? I think since it was first announced over 14 months ago, I think the world's gone mad. I think we're seeing a lot of it. I'm talking a lot about the pros and cons of AI, I have to say. I think a lot of government departments are looking at it as the silver bullet for a lot of legacy systems that they've had in the past and wanted to be innovative or modernise, but couldn't because it was too hard, too complex. And I think now this AI tool can now kick the can even further down the road in terms of now I can just interrogate my data. I spend most of my days talking to different governments around the world to say, okay, I want to AI something. And my role is to say, right, okay, what do you mean by that? Right, let me help you go through and work out what it is we're going to do, how's it going to work, and I always come back to the purpose of the department, is it to collect more tax, social benefits, or the environment? it's got to link back to that purpose. And if it doesn't, then why are you doing it? The two things I go through are why are you doing this? And then secondly, how are you going to do it? If it's going to take 10 years to get there, why are you doing it? I don't want to do that. And then eventually we'll come to, okay, what kind of technology are we talking about?
And now, Paulo, over to you. Same question. What have you seen in the last year?
Well, I was trying to think about that. I don't think I've been in as many rabbit holes in the past 12 months as I ever have in my entire life. I do truly believe it's been probably the most exciting year in tech since probably internet became mainstream. And I say that from a personal perspective because I'm basically a geek and I just enjoy new technologies. But with my Bank of England hat on, I think what really this means for public sector is unlocking productivity to a scale that we've never been able to do before. We've always been constrained by budgets and number of people that we can hire, talent. You know, we're not as competitive as the private sector, and having access to technology that essentially can give us additional headcount, keeping essentially the people that we have already on board, is incredibly exciting. It means that I can deliver additional projects like launching an Instagram channel or launching a podcast series. And it's something that we always wanted to do, but we didn't have capacity. Now I have little chatbots that can help us with that.
Great. And now, Mario, over to you. What have you seen in the last year? And also, what are your perspectives on the various uses of AI in the finance sector?
Thanks, Julian. Can I just say, first of all, what a great pleasure it is to be here at another OMFIF event and to see you all. I'm looking forward to a great discussion. On the way in, I was joking that, you got me from the Treasury today, but you could have got 20 other people, because that's the thing with these general technologies. It touches so much of what we do in the finance ministry. In terms of why the Treasury cares, I'm going to answer Steve's question directly, which is, for us as the Finance and Economics Ministry, we have 3 priority outcomes. There are top-level objectives, and one of those is maintaining the stability of the macroeconomic environment and the financial system. We meet that objective through our oversight and our ability to legislate for the financial services regulatory framework. And we're also the lead government department for the finance sector as a critical sector within the national economy. And the reason we've turned our attention to AI is because the finance sector is one of the keenest adopters. I think the McKinsey report, for example, last year had us in the top 3. And that brings loads of opportunities for the sector, but opportunities that you can only really exploit if you're able to mitigate the risks. So that is why we have a purview on this.
So, Steve, I want to come back to you and ask, could you describe how AI is being used to improve the distribution and integrity of financial news and data? So this is now coming to one of the central themes of this discussion, which is going to be the dissemination of financial information and knowledge.
Yeah, I think from what you said before as well about the financial institutions have been using this technology for quite a while. I think now, though, with AI, it's opened it up to a lot more people who don't have to, have PhD in financial solutions and so on. It's opened it up to the ordinary person, really, who can now access information, ask questions in a natural language, and literally just ask a question as you normally would do, whereas before you had to have some sort of programming or, Excel spreadsheet capabilities that, you had to go on training courses for. I think it's opened it up a lot from that perspective, and now you've got automated solutions that can take data from multiple sources, bring it together, give you the answers you're looking for, but you're able to ask it questions, whereas before someone would probably produce an Excel spreadsheet and chart and print it out and things like that, whereas now you can have that information, but you can now interrogate the information rather than give it back to someone to say, right, I want a view of this, and then they go away for another week and then come back with some more information. The challenge with that is you're getting now information from the whole internet, and
right.
So you have to think about the content, and I think this is where content credentials really matter.
Right, and could you speak a little bit about the ways Microsoft is engaging, perhaps with financial institutions on exactly these topics?
Yes, so we're working with all the government departments and financial institutions and virtually every company in the world now, really. And we have a responsible AI ethics team, massive team. And Brad Smith, who's our president, drives all our culture. And one of the mandates he has, and I speak about it often, is just because we can doesn't mean we necessarily should. And so everything we do with any organisation, we look at and say, right, should we be doing this? And so we look at the content credentials that we set up with the BBC and the New York Times, Project Origin. So you have metadata attached to data to say, this is from a trusted source. And I think you have to have that, where's the origin from? And I think when GPT came out, part of the hallucination problem was it would give you an answer, but you didn't know where it was from. So it was from the whole internet, whereas now the later versions and the internal ones like the Copilot and things give you those links to where that data was from. And so another thing I always say, it's about humans plus AI as well. So anytime you get an answer, you have to have a human that makes a decision on that. So you can get some financial information, and prime example is fraud. I do a lot around fraud. AI will show you that there's an anomaly there. It won't say that is fraud or that's an error. It'll show you there's something wrong. It's up to a human to look at it and decide what to do with that. So don't ever get to a stage where you automatically let AI make a decision, because then if you go to court or something like that and you say, oh, the bot told me, you're going to get thrown out. You've got to have that information in the background and say, here's where I got it. It wasn't from a black box. Here's all the information together. That's why we've brought it to court.
Well, Paula, I want to come over to you now and just ask, both with your Bank of England hat on, but also with your hat on as someone who's working very much in the communication side of things. How is AI shaping the way that you approach communications, and also maybe thinking a little bit about Steve's point about fraud as well, and public sector, private sector engagement? What are your thoughts?
Well, this has been the focus of my past 12 months at the Bank of England. I've been trying to educate people around me of the benefits alongside the risks of AI. Let's start with the risks. Let's start with the scary parts first. You're probably familiar that it will take 5 minutes for anyone to clone the voice of someone, and right now you can also generate very credible videos. And there is a huge reputational risk when you do that, because anyone could potentially leak a fake telephone conversation that is treated the same way, that could really move markets. And I demonstrated that to the governor himself, and I cloned his voice from a YouTube video. It took me literally 5 minutes. And it was very credible. This was already 12 months ago, so now the technology is probably, you can do that in 5 seconds, I'm not quite sure. But these risks are important to familiarize with, and until we have a regulatory system that looks at the entire industry and cooperation between public sector, private sector, and all these multinational companies, for all of us to come together and come up with a solid framework to really counteract these narratives, I think it's still very early days. It is just one massive grey area at the moment.
Can I jump in on that?
Yeah, absolutely.
You asked for this discussion on the panel. So, fully agree with you. And so, Microsoft some time ago launched the video authenticator. So that's a tool that looks at the videos and can see where it's been altered. There's subtleties in the video and the grayscales that a human wouldn't spot. And so you can see that. And also, again, come back to the content credentials. Having a credential attached to video shows that it's from a trusted source, or whether it's been altered in some way. But it's always getting better. And the video authenticator and other products from other companies will do the same type of thing. I've always got to stay ahead as well, because it's a balancing act.
But looking historically, we'll get into this little debate now. It's nice. Historically, essentially, the internet has always worked this way. You try to regulate and basically stop something bad from happening, and then it's just a cat and mouse game that is constantly evolving. And you have the dark web, which is this cesspit of anything that is illegal, and this will keep on happening. So I think it's important that we guard the channels as well as the technologies themselves. So if all this misinformation is spreading over social media, Microsoft and all the other big players should really make sure that, and the regulators, that they implement tools that automatically detect fake content.
Yeah. Well, I want to come back to that question too, about this race between regulators and the technology itself, but could you maybe say a little bit more about the ways in which you're seeing AI actively used at the bank?
Well, the way I'm promoting it, so I should probably introduce myself first. First of all, I'm head of content delivery, so I'm responsible for the Bank of England website, social media channels, and the publications. So essentially the digital channels. I don't work in the communications department, so I'm not really familiar with the finance world, and I like it to keep it that way. Essentially, my interest is creating content, promoting it, disseminating it, and measuring how well that's performing. So the way, obviously, generative AI can help us with that is by creating more innovative content. I personally developed a couple of AI chatbots trained on the content that is already available on the Bank of England website. We've not released it publicly yet because of hallucinations and some random answers, but it is being tested internally. The potential of that is, forgetting about the public using it, is for us really in the comms departments to test out ideas. We've used it to brainstorm certain concepts or certain campaign ideas that we wanted to try out. You just ask it to act as a SEO expert or a marketing expert or a podcast producer, and you bounce off ideas with that, and you have that kind of engagement, and it will pinpoint weaknesses and strengths of your ideas. You refine essentially a better product in the end. But you can also just point to a speech that we just published to say, okay, give me 5 LinkedIn posts targeting this type of audience based on this URL, and it will just create a beautiful social media plan just based on that. And that would have taken us probably a day and a half with a social media expert to do that. So it's this kind of, I can talk about this for hours, so stop me, please.
Well, Mario, I want to ask a similar question before we get back to the risk piece, which is, what are some of the use cases that you see, or maybe discussions about use cases that you're seeing at the Treasury?
Yeah, so when we talk to firms in the sector, it's really impressive the extent to which AI is being used already. Things like fraud detection, media analysis, customer services, know your customer. One thing that strikes me about all these processes that the firms are using is that they're often, and this goes back to your point, Steve, using internal data. So clearly this worry about ownership of data and the quality of the data is a real thing, and something where I think you need other governance processes to progress alongside the use cases in the sector. If I can respond to something before we forget it, and I'm completely destroying your plan, but is this point about explainability, which I think is particularly important in the finance sector. It comes up a bit in public services. For example, we're hearing from colleagues that we're talking to US government colleagues who are thinking of using AI to decide on the allocation of social housing, to make it the most efficient way to meet your KPIs.
I've been involved in that conversation.
Oh, there you go. I suppose the thing that must be hard to bring into that is what about things like fairness or the particular groups in society that you want to target? I think in the finance sector, the challenge is that so much of what we do is based on trust and confidence. I mean, many things that we work with don't have an intrinsic value, money, financial instruments, banking services rely on confidence. And without explainability, it's quite hard for participants, market participants, to extract signals from what's happening.
I'll add to that, because again, it comes back to why. Because when I got approached by our legal team in the States, and it was from the White House originally, and I used my usual stance, what are you trying to achieve? Because if you use AI, it will show you to say you've got a spare plot of land there, go and build 5,000 houses, but what kind of houses are they going to be? Who are you going to put in there? Who's it next to? Is it going to cause problems with the population that's already there? And that was a bit, they didn't know what, they just had the usual statement of, we've got to solve social housing. And that's where I challenge and say, what do you mean by that? What are you trying to achieve? Because otherwise, if you use AI, it will give you an answer, but you've then got to make a decision based on what are you going to do with it. And it could make things worse than it is now.
I don't know if you have a response to that, but I also wanted to ask you on the explainability point, what steps do you see as being potentially necessary to help deal with that challenge, which seems very fundamental to the way that we engage with AI in the financial sector?
It's fundamental, and I don't have an answer. And also because, as models get as all the frontier models get more and more complicated, it's just harder to understand why they're giving you these outputs, right? I mean, the thing you talked about earlier, I think is another good example. I don't want to get onto risks, but if you think of cybersecurity, AI often gets raised as something that's going to increase risk, but it's also a defensive tool, right? So I think you need to think about it from both perspectives. Yeah. But then you get into, I'm trying to make a decision on whether to trust this AI model by asking another AI model. What happens once they start talking to each other and, second guessing what the other model is going to say. I mean, that is...
Yeah. I think the important bit is where the data's from. So if you use ChatGPT, then that is the internet data. So if you ask it a question, it's going to give you a general answer. If you asked about some tax things in the UK, it might give you an answer from Australia or Norway or something like that. With the new ones, Copilot and Azure OpenAI, that's looking at your data. So it's more specific. It's going to give you a better answer because you're only looking at your data. And as I say, when you're talking about the housing, I was saying, well, which data are you going to look at? Because if you're just looking at one set of data, it's going to be biased probably. But if you use 5 sets of data, that might be 5 sets of biased data. So you got to think about the data all the time. Is what am I looking at? And I still come back to the outcome. What's the business outcome? Not the technology outcome. What's the business outcome you're looking for?
Well, with that, I think that this is now a good time to talk about the risk side of things in a little bit more depth. So, Mario, back over to you. What risks do you anticipate?
So I think you can put them in 2 categories. There is how AI exacerbates risks that already exist within the sector. And in a way, most new technologies do that to some extent. But you can think of, for example, macro financial risks like trade and convergence, or how AI could encourage customers to take deposits out of banks during a run, for example. There's also the operational risk vector, where obviously financial sector firms are already doing lots, but what happens if you end up with a lot of the technology concentrated in a small number of providers? What does that do for your supply chain management? We talked about cybersecurity and how it reduces the cost of entry for malicious actors. And then there is the harder category, which is the one that we talked about a minute ago earlier, the new risks that are created from the interconnectivity between AI models and being able to understand why models are giving you certain outputs. That will be my referential framework for risks. And obviously the solution to a lot of that is, in part, good regulation. And I know my colleague from DCIT, Ellie, in the next panel is going to tell you all about this. But there's also a responsibility on the user and in the sector, the firms, to make sure that they are not taking undue risk.
And given those, stakeholders that are responsible for using these system safety or creating frameworks for their safe use, and the speed with which the technology is developing, do you have thoughts at all about the capacity for us to really safely embrace AI in the financial sector and overcome some of these challenges, just given the rate at which it's moving forward?
The thing that I think is challenging is that the benefits are so huge. So, the McKinsey paper, for example, has some incredible estimates for productivity improvements in the banking sector. So I can imagine that, everyone's just racing to the door to try to get this set up, and Steve here is helping them do it safely. The thing that worries me is the non-continuities, as I talked about earlier. So, you might be thinking that you're on a path to extract all these productivity benefits, but then something goes wrong. Right. And I think in finance in particular, you can't really afford for things to go wrong very often. It's not like, the provision of media content or whatever, because of the role of confidence and trust. The UK is doing a lot of things to try to make AI adoption safe, and Ellie will tell you all about this in a minute, but, including the announcements that we had in the budget a couple of weeks ago.
Right. Well, this is a good time to turn back over to you, Paulo, and ask you the same question. So what risks do you see, and how would you assess the response to deal with them so far?
Well, Mario covered essentially all the risks that I could think of, but beyond that, I'd like to broaden the conversation a little bit more. I also see the control of the tools that AI relies on, so microchips, for example. I think just having a few companies that will control the technology will spark potentially conflict, and we're already seeing that on the trade side of things, with America regulating or blocking imports or exports of microchips to China, for example. So I think these global dynamics are going to be shaped increasingly over the coming months, really. What that means basically for the global financial markets, I'm not probably the best person to answer that. And also just having these technologies in the hands of a few gigantic companies that are going to become even richer. What does that mean for society as a whole? That's a wider question. But bringing it back to Bank of England, I already mentioned essentially the dissemination of fake content. That obviously has a direct impact could have impact on markets, investors, etc. We saw, I think it was May last year, there was an image of the Pentagon, and it was a fake image essentially. I think there was an explosion or some smoke coming out of it, and that affected the markets, even though it was not pulled. It was pulled essentially pretty quickly by the social media companies that were disseminating it. But that's just a simple example of what the risks associated with generating fake AI content. And we can apply all the regulation that we can with watermarks, etc. But when you have open source models that can actually be implemented on the dark web again, that's not going to be the case. And
right.
That's obviously, and the speed of it. So just as much as I don't need to hire a team of 50 people just to launch a new channel, for example, malicious actors can do exactly the same, just relying on AI to disseminate content and target different strategies at the same time. I think we've never seen anything of that scale.
Right. And so, Mario, your point earlier about the actors that really need to get AI right in order to adopt kind of safe embrace of artificial intelligence. You mentioned firms, you mentioned individuals, and you mentioned government. So on a firm level, over to you, Steve, I'm curious what you see as Microsoft's role in helping ensure the safe embrace of AI. And, if we could also, pay particular attention to, topics related to misinformation, for example, I think that would be helpful.
I think, everyone probably knows about Satya, our CEO, and things like that, but the culture of our company is led by Brad Smith. And I recommend you go onto YouTube and look at some of the videos from him, because he is very much around our social responsibility. I'd say Microsoft these days is more of a sustainability company. We take it very seriously. Like I said before about responsible AI is our backbone around what we do or don't do. And he drives us all the time around that. And there's lots of things we do around our social responsibility. We work with a lot of the governments around the world, a lot of the cybersecurity people. We work a lot with the likes of the UK government, the US government around cybersecurity. We put a lot of effort into when it was the Ukraine war, around all the attacks from Russia, and we closed down a lot of cybersecurity and organised crime, fraud. We've got huge amounts of teams. We spend billions on research, and a lot of that is around the cybersecurity and the mitigation and the misinformation, disinformation, a lot in terms of elections. So there's 2 billion people are going to be voting this year, for prime ministers and so on. We take that really seriously, so we're providing tools to governments to try and stop that election rigging type of thing. And we push a lot for AI governance. So again, Brad Smith is on a lot of the government organisations. Our UK CEO, Claire Barclay, is part of the PM's governance board around AI as well, around technology. And so we're on all of those boards, and we push for AI governance. We've got internal governance based on 6 principles, and which we push on, into other organisations. Say, this is what you need to think about. It's not necessarily say this is what you have to do and you need to follow us, but just say we've learned over time. There's things that happened to us many, many years ago, and we've learned from that. There's a quite a famous email from Bill Gates many years ago that changed our whole organisation to be one on trust, and that's what it's about now. One of our strap lines is Microsoft runs on trust, because if people don't trust us, we're going to go out of business, basically. So we need to keep that trust going. But as I say, part of our culture is around helping others to achieve that as well, and we take it really seriously.
we're going to open it up in just a few minutes to audience questions. So if you do have questions that you'd like to ask, now is a good time to start thinking about those. But now I want to turn it over to Mario and Paolo again, if you both want to respond to this question, which is kind of to Steve's point here about the importance of there being some interaction between the private and public sector in terms of getting AI governance right. There is this odd tension where the financial firms that are benefiting, they're for-profit companies trying to innovate in this technology, and it's a bit of a race to try to make as much progress as possible, are seemingly also instrumental in the governance of that very technology. And so I'm wondering if you have thoughts, maybe Paula, starting with you, on how you deal with that.
Well, this might just my personal opinion, but you touched exactly on the point I wanted to raise. Obviously, the private sector is there to essentially increase profit margins, and I would always take with a pinch of salt, essentially all attempts of greenwashing, etc., etc., etc. We've seen that from the corporate world for a long time. So I think it's about finding a good balance between corporate good, but also making sure that essentially the public sector is the one driving it, in the driving seat. Because you can have essentially very powerful multinational corporations lobbying governments. That's what we don't want, because otherwise we end up like America.
Mario, over to you.
I think successful regulation is based on good private-public partnership. I think taking one step back, I think it's helpful that the Department for Science, who in the government overall own the regulatory approach to AI, in their white paper and response have adopted a very flexible approach and adaptable, one based on context and principles rather than specific technologies that have to be mitigated. And that is because the pace of change is so fast. And when it comes to the financial sector regulators, the bank, the PRA, and the Financial Conduct Authority, I mean, a lot of their approach is based on getting the right outcomes rather than deciding what inputs can or can't go into the process. It's also very much relationship-based and flexible. I mean, if you take the supervision of operational resilience, for example, I think it was in 2021 they set up a public-private AI forum to talk to firms. Now they've got their standing body, the Cross-Market Operational Resilience Group itself is also set up an AI working group so that the firms can work with the regulators and with government on where next. Because, to an extent, we all want similar outcomes.
Right.
So I think it's very important to exchange perspectives.
Okay. Well, we're going to switch in a minute to the optimistic side of this and look at some of the opportunities that might be emerging from AI in the financial sector. But before we get there, I want to open it up to audience questions. There are going to be people handing out microphones from our side. So, yeah, we've got a question right there.
Michael Borelli, AI and Partners. I'd like to direct this question to Mario, if that's okay. You mentioned KYC in terms of Treasury use cases. So we're still, to a certain extent, struggling with KYC. How do you think firms are dealing with KYAI, Know Your AI system?
Thank you, Mike. Great question. So, it goes back to what I said a minute ago. The way the FCA will regulate that is that they will say these are the outcomes that we expect you to achieve as a firm. For example, for critical services that the firm needs to provide, there will be a set of expectations and tolerances as to what constitutes good. So, you don't have to have it perfect all the time, and systems go down, things don't work, and that's normal because you're dealing with complex technologies. But, there's a threshold, a tolerance beyond which, you're not providing the level of service that we, the regulators, expect you to provide. But therefore, it's up to the firm to be able to understand what inputs they're bringing into this. However, it's tricky when the technology is changing so quickly, and this is why I think some of the things that the Department for Science is doing through the AI Safety Institute, also extra funding in the budget 2 weeks ago for the Alan Turing Institute, all of this will be in the ecosystem to help us all make the most of the opportunities that exist within AI without taking on too much more risk. Hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much.
Would anyone else like to respond to that?
I think it's a very good question, I have to say, because you will get IT companies, mine as well, saying this is going to answer the problem, or it's not going to be this is going to answer everything for you. And I keep coming back to what is it you're trying to achieve. Then you can start to look at, is AI technology that one or that one, which provides the best one? Great question.
Phil?
Phil Middleton from OMFIF. We've heard a lot about potential increases in productivity as a result of AI. But at the moment it seems to be a bit like the invention of the typewriter and its effect on the room full of clerks. I mean, yes, it's got a lot more work done more quickly, but it didn't produce Shakespeare. I'd just like to ask the panel, are you aware at the moment of transformational use cases for AI that are taking us a step beyond simply doing better automation of data analysis and parsing?
Can we take that one as well?
Mario, but when do we start with you?
You know, that's a great question, Phil. And I went to some big economics conference, and there were 2 papers on the productivity improvements expected from AI from completely different organizations. And I think that they coordinated in advance, and they both presented a range of annual productivity impacts between 0 and 3 percentage points a year, roughly. And not only are these estimates huge and very wide, they both had the same range, which made me think that maybe some AI had generated them. I'll let Steve answer, you know, where do you think there can be something truly transformational?
Right. Yeah, so I see a lot of that, I have to say, and I'm also old enough to remember that when computers came in and there was rooms full of typists, because I was a taxman before I became an IT person, so actually in the tax office back in Liverpool. And so when we brought in computers, then, you know, there's a huge uproar about the typists wouldn't have a job. But they went into the business and did other things, and I see the same things here. And I do a lot of presentations on this. You know, if you look 10 years ago, who would have thought there was a social media influencer or drone engineer and things like that? And I see now, there's quite a famous quote from someone in America, I can't remember now, but AI won't take your job, but somebody who understands AI will probably take your job. So it's here to stay. So you've got to, you know, get on board with it. There are some specific use cases, because again, I keep coming back to what are you trying to do? So there's use cases like the call centres, where there are a number of government departments who can't even answer the phone. Never mind deal with the question, but can't even answer the phone. And so they're looking at AI in terms of help reducing that call, and normally it's between 6 and 9 minutes. So how can we get that down so our call agents can deal with questions easier? And so having a co-pilot to say, why has Mr. Barr's why has he received a tax bill of X? And it will come back straight away and say, well, it's because he's now got income from rentals. And what it will also do is summarise that call, because it's listening into the call, it summarises that call and therefore automates that into the case management system. And all that data is still on, you know, that department's tenant. It's not in the, you know, up in Microsoft Cloud or whatever. And so that's a real business case where that is going to reduce the time taken, because at the moment they're aiming for 30% reduction, because at the moment they cannot deal with the calls. And also by creating self-service as well using AI, because I've done a lot of chatbots in the past, and you have to think about what questions people ask and then come up with the answers and have it like in an Excel database behind it. Whereas now, as Paolo said, you just pointed at the information. I can ask a question, but how I ask a question is completely different than how you would ask the question. You can get an answer back, but you can ask a follow-on question, and therefore that's stopping the people phoning the department. And so those things are transformational, because then you're going to provide a better service to your customers. I see the same with the finance type of thing, whereas things used to take, you know, weeks or whatever. I think going forward now, I can get some financial information if I want to, rather than phone someone.
Paolo, I'm curious if you have anything to add on to that as well, and also, you know, maybe what you've seen. You spoke about it already briefly, but anything you would like to add to that?
Well, my thoughts are perhaps slightly more philosophical. in my view, this is obviously going to affect the job market, whether we like it or not. So a lot of roles, like secretaries, we were talking earlier, co-pilot can essentially attend your meeting instead of yourself, so it will send you notes. It's great, but it is going to make a lot of roles essentially no longer required by society. This is happening at a very, very high speed. It's not like the Industrial Revolution that happened over decades. So what that will mean, obviously, it's a strong impact on society, but what I like to think is, what will this look like in 20 years' time? Having a essentially workforce that no longer does that, but what can they actually do? And I'm thinking that this is where perhaps creativity in the future will come up, will spark new ideas, new ways for society to actually function. This is the real exciting part for me. And also I think it makes us question what being human means, not because we're talking about cognitive self-conscious, etc., but because you can create art essentially from AI at the moment. Whether you want to call it art or not, it's an open question, but it also makes us think as like, what is art produced by myself? I'm just essentially putting together all my memories and visual recollections into a piece of art, or producing music.
Can I just briefly pass on? It's all social displacement, job displacement, productivity improvement, all very classical in terms of technological progression. Let me ask Mario Paolo, though, do you think AI is going to be able to help you spot the next financial crisis in advance and prevent it happening?
Prevent it happening? No, but the science, yes, absolutely. This is not just AI. Algorithms essentially have been around for a long time. We can spot, and we have social listening tools, not just us, but they're very commonly used across any industry, really. So you can set it to trigger specific alerts based on like increasing conversation, certain keywords, and that doesn't have to be linked to AI. It will, there are certain markers that will indicate that something big is happening. So you can then prevent slightly as an organization like the Bank of England. You could look at those and then say, okay, let's prepare an action plan for when that and if that happens.
I'd like to add to that because I've been in those conversations where you want to see where the next company is going to go under. And so you can see now with the analysis of so many companies, you can start to see, as you say, there's trigger points to say, right, this is starting to happen now. We predict in 6 months' time a company is going to go under. And that gives you the time then to intervene, to stop it going under and to support it and things like that. Whereas before, you didn't know it could just happen. So it helps with that type of stuff.
I think the question about market risk is a good one.
Yeah, it's a great question, Phil. I mean, I think the PRA are already using some tools. I mean, in their case, and they have it in the manual, don't they, of supervision. It's judgment based as well. I mean, they're only supervising 180 banks. However, using AI as a tool helpful. Where I think it has a lot more potential is in what the FCA have to do, because they got 40,000 firms across a range of different sectors. Now, that is not really about system-wide stability, but we also care about consumer harm. So, I think for them, and I know they're also using it for some applications, I think it can be really helpful. Just going back to something for you, Steve, I mean, I'll be really interested in whether AI is being used in education as well, because that's the other way you can get at, output, right?
Yeah.
In the classic model is physical capital and human capital. It seems to me that the way that we allow citizens to accumulate human capital could be transformed by these technologies. And then
it's a difficult one, I'll say, because of the data and what you can and can't do. Because, to be honest, I was working with a council a few years back, and what I was trying to say with them is if you combine data that they've already got, like adult data and children's data, what you can start to see is if two parents start to get sick, then 6 months down the line, an A-grade student will start to see it going down. So going forward, you can start to say, right, okay, this trigger point means we can, put some interventions against that child to support that child. You then have, the same department saying, we can't connect the data, because of GDPR and all that kind of thing. And I think that's where, I've been trying to get departments to share data for 20 years, particularly with the likes of HMRC and DWP. And there's a lot of legislation there, but there's a lot of myths and egos and stuff that stops you doing that. And I think that's what I've seen the biggest change probably in the last 5 years is with governments now agreeing to share data. And so you see now if you go on and get a driver's license, it now takes your photograph from your passport, which I think is phenomenal. Why wouldn't you do that? But there's a lot of other things that we want to do, but that requires data sharing. And I'm doing a lot of stuff with like the OECD Tax Administration 3.0, which is about sharing data and natural systems and things like that. But there's a lot of work that has got to go in, a lot of agreement to say, yes, we can do that, rather than, no, we can't. And I do a lot of cybersecurity on cloud, and I get a lot of, we can't do that. And again, I try to say, why not? Show me where it's written down that we can't do that. And how many years ago was that written? You know, you've got to start looking to say, right, okay, what is the risk if we share information? And we have a thing called confidential computing, which means different departments can put data into this system. Neither department can see either the data, but then you can get the insights out of that data. And there's a lot of things you do with health data and things like that where you can do that kind of thing. Get the insights, but either party can't see the data. And I think that's a big game changer as well, because nobody wants to share the data, even though it's all the UK government or the American government or any other company. That's where it's got to come from. You've got to share the data.
We have another question in the audience that I want to come to. And just in the interest of time, if anyone does have a question, just be sure to raise your hand. But John, coming over to you. Next.
Thank you, Julian. This is essentially a question for Mario and the likely direction of financial regulation. The culpability for decision making. So Stephen's just said that AI shouldn't make material decisions, it should provide the information to help make them. But if it does make a decision, who's culpable, including a manager that's running the AI that doesn't understand necessarily how the model works?
Great question.
Good grenade.
Well, I'm going to pass it back to you in a minute. Wait. I mean, my understanding is that all the developers are super clear with the users that the liability is with them. So we build this model, you use it, if something goes wrong, your problem. Wasn't there a big Air Canada case? Yeah, I think, I don't normally follow what happens with the legal wranglings of Air Canada, but I think it was that someone went on, wanted compensation for a delay, the bot said you can get it, and then I think Air Canada were trying not to honour it because the bot said this, and they were like, it doesn't matter, you set up the bot, so it's your liability. Yeah. So that is my perspective on it, and I think it doesn't really change necessarily if you're in the finance sector and you're any other regulated sector. What do you think, Steve?
I think it's a great question, because I think it's so hard. It's why we dropped facial recognition technology a few years back, because it was inaccurate. And so, for me, it is who's culpable. We can provide the technology, but again, I can push back and say, yeah, but you were using it. We've warned you to say it's got to be a human decision. And I talk about this on a daily basis with lots of different customers to say, you can't let the AI make the decision. It will show you something. It will show you something anomalous with the data, but you have to make that decision, and you need to back it up, because if you go to court, you're the one who's going to be standing there, and you will be held responsible. I remember many years ago, actually, in the tax office, when someone had used a machine to disparage another company, and that person then sent it on to someone in that company. And it was way before GDPR and stuff like that. The original company and it was a public department, got sued for £440,000 because it was on their desktop. And they hadn't put in sufficient controls to stop someone sending an email out to then be forwarded on to someone, and the company sued because it was defamation of the character of the company. And so I think it's got to be both, working together to say, right, okay, here's the governance model we're talking about. Here's what the technology can do, but you've got to understand what the liability are, and therefore work with us, and we can lock it down, and provide those controls, because it is new technology that is still growing.
I think we are helping in another way, which is in the bill last year, the Financial Services and Markets Act. We introduced a regime for critical third parties in the finance sector. So that will capture a supplier of AI if they were supplying enough firms for their service to the sector overall to be systemic. And that's going to be delivered by early next year. However, that doesn't give you a complete answer, because I imagine some firms, the really big ones, are developing their own capabilities internally. Although presumably in a perfectly competitive market, you think over time, if a lot of people being supplied by a third party that has to follow certain regulation, you might try to ensure that your own in-house model does a similar thing or attains a similar standard.
We got another question here, but before we come to that, Paolo, I just want to ask you, on this, where the communication of a central bank is potentially market moving, what do you make of the capacity of the Bank of England, and what restrictions are in place regarding the Bank of England's communications?
Well, central banks in general tend to be fairly risk averse, I'd say. So things move very, very slowly. Hence why some of that Air Canada case is a clear example why just my roadmap of releasing the chatbot to the public just has been paused for the time being. The way I try to educate people around me is that AI is not the end solution. It is not a copy and paste job. It is something that you should look as a source and then re-edit and make it your own. That goes back a little slightly to your question earlier. We shouldn't look at it as the solution. It's a tool, and I love actually Microsoft's brand name for it, Copilot. It's not in the driving seat; it's your Copilot there to support you.
It's not autopilot.
Yes,
it is
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Although there are auto GPTs that are getting to that level, and that's why we're still not really using generative AI in our communication, but it is happening.
Do you think it's only a matter of time till the Monetary Policy Committee minutes are written by Copilot?
Yes, certainly. There is no reason why they shouldn't be.
Someone needs to check it.
And also perhaps written in a language that is slightly more accessible. That's my job in communication, is to do that. To translate technical language into palatable language.
I think we've got a couple questions right over here. Yeah.
Sure. William Mason from Guernsey. As sort of speaking as a regulator, one of the issues which I wonder about, I haven't got a firm answer on it, is how far, when you're regulating thousands of firms, do you push the line that things have to be explainable or stroke transparent? Because, going back a bit, I was told that was remarkably difficult to achieve with AI, certainly if you're using advanced neural networks. And if you insist on that level of explainability, then effectively you were going to disrupt firms from being able to use advanced AI. I think things have become more explainable over the last 18 months since I sort of last looked at that in depth. But have you got any of the panelists as communication specialists got current views on how explainable we should be insisting the systems, the people we regulate, should be?
Sounds like a question for you.
It's a great question, and I don't know the answer. I think if you look at the development of financial resilience supervision in the sector, one way you can try to understand where you have gaps or where there are unknown links between parts of the system is by following some sort of stress testing regime with scenarios. And the bank, I think last year, the year before, did the first ever cyber stress test. So that's one way that you're trying to explore how, the whole system is connected to each other, and whether when you shock it, there's anything that you've missed. So you can imagine in time using a similar approach for this sort of thing, but I don't know, by then it'd be too late, wouldn't it? So, yeah. I don't know. Maybe my colleagues.
I'm going to still say it's got to be explainable. Yep. I think when GPT first came out, it just gave you the answer, but didn't say where it got it from. Whereas now, when you look at it, it will give you a list of 3 or 4 or 5 links at the bottom of where it got that information. So you can click on that and go and check those answers to make sure it is what you think it is, and from the UK or whatever. I think it's always got to be transparent. I do. It's one of our principles in terms of the responsible AI, you know, with fairness and inclusivity and reliability and things like that. But, you know, transparency, it's got to be explainable.
We've got a few questions here, so let's take two at a time now.
Yeah. The cost of building some of these GPT systems is staggeringly high, which means that there's going to be a consolidation likely of the providers of these services. How do you see the ongoing risk of so many firms, so many asset managers, hedge funds using the same sorts of models and therefore accentuating the same risks and making a quant crash seem like a simple dream that we thought of in the past, and now we have the real issues to deal with?
Very glad you asked that. That was one of the final questions I was going to ask. So, yeah.
In terms of explainability, if I use an AI in a trading system, what kind of explainability would you expect, and what would be the value of it?
Okay, great. Well, who would like to start there?
I don't know about that last one. I still think you've got to have it explainable, because I think, you know, if you look at the London Stock Exchange, their trading deals are done by AI now, haven't they, for many years, and they're done like in milliseconds. But I'm presuming, I don't know that system, but presumably, if someone interrogated that data to say, why did it buy shares in such and such a company, it must be explainable.
Right.
I would have thought. I don't know the system well. But if it doesn't, I think that's quite scary for me in terms of it, you know, because if it buys something within milliseconds, whereas before it was a human, you could cause a stock market run. But I think they've got controls in place, haven't they, to stop that. So if there's a run on some stock, it stops the sale, I think. I don't know the stock market very well from that perspective.
Yeah, I mean, on to you. I mean, this question about algorithm convergence is one that a lot of folks have brought up. I mean, I know Gary Gensler recently mentioned this as well. So your thoughts on these 2 points?
It's a great question, but isn't every market crash ultimately because there's been an approach that's been followed by a large number of participants or a convergence in a particular strategy, which, when shocked with new information that challenges the assumption behind that model, whether it be a mental model or a computational model, leads to a large correction. I mean, we had one in September 2022, right? I think the other thing that you can do, that I know the regulators are doing, I think is a very good innovation, is the system-wide exploratory scenario that they've been talking about in the past year, which allows you to think about those sorts of challenges. But it's no different to, I don't know, Black-Scholes, that's a model, that went wrong.
I would have thought that AI would help with this, though. Before, when, you know, there was a run on a company stock and no one really realised that, now with AI, it would spot that quite quickly and say, hold on, something's going on here, and highlight it to a person to then say, right, stop doing, let's see what's causing that run. Is it something is going on with the company that's creating that, or is it just the algorithms, you know, going in a circle type thing?
It looks like you want to respond.
Yeah, so I mean, 2 observations from your comments, right? One is, of course, there have been many flash crashes already, right, caused by algorithmic trading. AI, not AI, right? And secondly, I mean, you've just demonstrated the dichotomy between outcomes-based measures, right, hence the stress testing, etc., and technology-based measures, hence, oh no, whatever it is, we have to explain it, right? And I think it's fascinating to see that dichotomy right there in the panel, yeah, which is being acted out, you know, across the board and with vastly different opinions.
Yeah.
What would be your proposed way forward? I thought that, if you don't mind.
Not on record, thank you.
Fair enough. Well, we do have time for one last question. Phil? Okay. Well, we've got one question right there. All right, yeah.
I hate to push the point on explainability, but it's Michael from Swift. I'm in the AI team. A question about explainability, Stephen, and maybe for the whole panel as well.
Stop calling me Stephen, it's very formal.
Sorry, Steve. On explainability, when you look at something like a large language model, fundamentally, from my understanding, it looks at patterns and then it makes a guess on the information moving forward, right? So when we talk about explainability, is that really a principle fundamentally that can work with something like that technology? And when we look at something like Copilot, that's great because it gets your prompts, it gets, from what I understand, your documents that you have maybe in your SharePoint, it adds that to the prompt, but then what it fundamentally does is it goes to a large language model like GPT 3.5, and it uses that to make a decision on the underlying data, and then it brings it back and tries to check it, right? But you might have explainability on the underlying data that it's tried to look at, but you don't have explainability on how it's made that decision, because that's fundamentally how the model works, right? So you may not have a specific answer to that, but it's just a question for the panel, and I think multiple people have brought it up. Is really explainability the right principle, or should we really be focusing on the output and saying how are we going to grade the accuracy of the output when we fundamentally can't actually explain how a model has made a decision?
That's a great question.
It is. So in terms of guessing, what it's doing is as you're doing the prompt, it's guessing what the next word would be based on what phrases it's seen in the past. The large language models we used to train the model, it doesn't, when you ask a prompt now, it doesn't go back to the large language model to interpret it because the model's already trained. It's looking at the data you've got, but you can still explain it. So in previous ways, there was, you would show a model, here's an apple, here's a cat, here's a dog, and you would show it that kind of thing. And then the next one with deep learning and things is showing different pictures and letting it learn itself what the pictures were and how to play Pac-Man and things like that by losing the games and things like that. Whereas the large language models, as I say, has used all the data from the internet to learn how to answer something, but it's not using that data source to then answer your question. It's like when you're a toddler and you're shown things and you learn things, you don't refer back to being a toddler on how you answer the question, if that makes sense. So when you're going into Copilot, as an example, it's looking at your data to answer the question, but it's not going back to the large language model to get the answer first. It was just used to train the model on how to look at data. I know it's really hard to explain, to be honest.
I think if you look at,
No, great.
just beyond Copilot, so if you look at large language models, it's a great question. And I think the system should still be able to explain the logic behind the decision. And you could train the system to output for each decision that it's making to automatically output the logic. So you almost keep a record, a log that you can go back and query. However,
it just doesn't work like that.
No, but you can ask it why. So,
but it's guessing why.
Well, it in a way, but like there's a lot of things I do about electronic invoice anomaly detection, and so you pad in millions of invoices, and then it'll come out and say, right, okay, these 10% look anomalous, and you can say to it why, and it won't say, oh, because the large language model already was, 0.89 coefficient type thing. It will say because this company doesn't make that product. So there's the explainability. It's the explainability of the reasoning, not explainability of the large language model underneath. As I say, when I go to court and I want to prosecute that company for not making a declaration of tax on goods, I don't really want to know about the large language model. I want a report in a Word document to say this company was selected because it makes galvanized bolts, but it's actually trying to say it sells bananas. And things like that. That's the explainability of it.
Mario, maybe a final comment from you on all of this.
So if you were, different firms in the sector will have different strategies and different preferences for risk and reward. So imagine that you're faced with two propositions, one where you can go some way towards understanding why the model is giving you some outputs and one where you don't. considering that you need to stay in business for a long time and there are significant non-linearities in the finance sector, on the whole, you can imagine a lot of people preferring a model that maybe doesn't give you so much productivity improvement straight away, but where you can understand the risk a bit better. And that's particularly relevant if you think you're going to be in a world where the information set changes all the time and a lot, right? So I think that's why it's absolutely right that the Department for Science has made explainability and transparency one of the core principles in the approach to regulation. And, you know, if what I've said is true over time, you can imagine all the players that stay in the market are the ones that offer, you know, some visibility as to why the model is making these decisions.
I can give you a specific example. There's one where in customs, if it's going to sound really daft, this, but if you're exporting chickpeas, if it's just in a bag, it's only 5% VAT on, or customs duty, whereas if it's in a tin, it's 20%. And so what a lot of companies will say is it's just in a package, it's not tinned. And what the AI model is looking at is going through that data and saying, right, okay, judging by the customs code and the price and the weight, the weight is much heavier than it would normally look like. And so therefore, that's showing you the explainability to say, that's why we've selected that one as anomalous. As I say, it's up to a human then to look at it and go, actually, I think that was just a mistake by the company. Normally the company's quite good. But that's the explainability of it.
Well, we can continue all of this
let's carry on.
Well, we're going to break for drinks and refreshments right now, and we're going to be back at 4 p.m. for our second panel, where we're going to be hearing about the future of UK AI regulation and governance. So, thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, so thanks everyone for coming back. We hope you enjoyed the break and refreshments. So we're now going to turn to our second panel of the day, which is going to be much more focused on the regulatory side of things, governance of AI, both domestic and international. And for this discussion, I'm very excited to welcome Anne Leslie, who is the Cloud Risk and Controls Leader for Europe at IBM. We're also joined by Professor Robert Traeger, who is the Director of the AI Governance Initiative at the University of Oxford's Martin School. And finally, we're also joined by Ellie Sweet, who plays a key role in the UK's AI policy response through her position in AI regulation at the UK Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. So we'll start out with a very open-ended question for you, Robert, which is, can you give us a lay of the land and tell us a little bit about what you see in AI governance today?
What I see in AI governance is a lot of interest all around the world. A lot of commonality in terms of approach, but not full commonality. I would say, you know, in places like China, they have an AI model registry, which is very interesting. So there you have to declare models of a certain size or capability to the government. The government finds out a few things about those models. That's a direction that some countries appear to be moving a bit. But I think all countries seem to be trying to wrestle with a common set of problems that include how can we get transparency into what companies are doing? Once we get that transparency, how can we sort of evaluate that? And once we evaluate that a little bit, what are the mitigations? And so I think there is this sort of common set of problems all over the world. There's a set of international discussions, and there's so many international governance fora that we have to talk about interpretability or interoperability, excuse me, you have to talk about interoperability, not just in terms of the technology, but in terms of the governance frameworks themselves. And I would just say that I think we're at this sort of moment where there's so many statements of principle. And the question is, will we be able to move from a statement of principle to practice? And we see in a lot of other cases of particularly international conversations, we see that that is where things founder. Climate change would be a prominent example of that, arguably. Not completely, but in some part. And so will we be able to overcome that? And I think finance is this really interesting area for a few reasons. One is that there's a sort of early adoption when it comes to AI. So some of the analogies that people have when they worry about the impact of AI in other sectors are actually just analogies that come from finance. And when we think more broadly about AI safety, I think some of those conversations, when we think about particular risk pathways, often they run through some sort of interaction with the financial sector, because the financial sector is bound up with resources. And so if some sort of AI is appropriating resources to do things, that probably involves an engagement with the financial sector. So if the financial sector is robust, then maybe that is important not just for itself, but more generally. So I think finance is a model in a lot of interesting ways. I don't want to go on too long, so maybe I'll stop there. But I'm sure we'll have a lot to talk about.
Well, we're going to get onto the UK's response in a moment, but and I want to turn to you and ask how AI is transforming risk and management practices in finance, and just broadly what you see in sort of picking up on our discussions in the previous panel.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. So I really like those comments that Robert was making in terms of, sort of the commonality. And what was interesting was you took sort of, the country level posture of it. Whereas in my day-to-day work, I'm maybe much more at the micro level. What are individual firms trying to do? And I think that's, it's sort of the convergence of these statements, high-level principles. One of the things that we've noticed is that a lot of the statements of principle and the direction maybe the regulation is going, it tells you what not to do. And I've been working with a group, people within IBM and also in the wider industry, alongside the Open Group, thinking about professional practice and trying to actually move beyond the statement of the words, which, while laudable and noble and important, they're not enough. And particularly in terms of AI systems, maybe the last frontier is going to be the IT architects, the actual people who are going to be designing systems, making the decisions, and it's the behaviors. And how are we evaluating what acceptable is? What does it mean? What does it look like? What is the risk that we're willing to tolerate? So when we start looking at what's happening from a risk and compliance perspective, it's not that there's a lack of good intent, but there is a space where bad things could happen, and even with good intent. So, I've been having kind of anecdotal conversations with people in risk functions in large banks saying, there's so much pressure from a business perspective to move fast. We have to. It's like this breathless, frenetic activity. We've got to move. We can't miss this. And things that are potentially hazardous, but may only manifest in terms of consequences 5 years from now, maybe further down the line, are being written away with a risk letter, which may or may not be appropriate. So there are multiple dimensions to this in terms of what are we willing to accept? How are we characterizing acceptability? And I really liked some of the comments from Steve Barrett from Microsoft earlier in terms of having emblematic figures in companies, be they users or the producers of the technology, is super important because they embody values. And he was talking about a decision to say we could do certain things, but we are going to choose not to. And that's crucial. There is a tendency to talk about we must not stifle innovation. That is a choice. That is not a natural law. And in what cases is it appropriate? Maybe not stifle, but to redirect, to put some guardrails around it. And I think it needs to be acceptable to ask uncomfortable questions and to have uncomfortable conversations and to challenge some of the things that we have taken as truth. Are they allowing us to get to better outcomes? The question that you asked, I loved it. We're betting the farm on explainability. Is it enough? It could be explainable, but still be a terrible outcome. You have wonderful clarity on how you got to it, but is it getting us to a good place? If it's not, should we be doing that, even if we can't explain it? So the evaluation of what we're trying to achieve, I think that's part of the discussion around risk and compliance. You can be compliant, but is it a high enough bar? You know, we could be ticking all the boxes and infringing nothing, but are we holding ourselves to a high enough standard of accountability?
There's a lot that I want to follow up. That's really a very, very helpful answer. But Ellie, I want to come on to you. Can you tell us a little bit about the UK government's response to AI, how it's viewing regulation, and what some of those guiding principles are?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for having me here today. So safe to say it's been a very busy year in the world of AI regulation. So look back into sort of March 2023, the UK government set out a white paper that set out a sort of comprehensive regulatory framework for AI. And as Mario spoke to earlier, this was a principles-based framework, an outcomes-based framework. The idea being that we'd set out some principles and those would be kind of interpreted and applied by our existing regulators within their sectors. And the underlying kind of philosophy behind that is that the risk posed by AI depends on the context in which it's used, and therefore it's a kind of better to kind of have our existing expert regulators interpret and apply those principles within their existing remits rather than necessarily standing up a whole new regulatory framework. So that was lauded as a sensible approach. On the same day that paper was published, the Future of Life Institute wrote a letter calling for the immediate halting of all model development. So the conversation moved on pretty quickly. And in the year since we published the white paper, we've obviously hosted the AI Safety Summit, we've established the AI Safety Institute, and we've really been thinking about the risk at the frontier. So the conversation is moving very, very fast. What we kind of put out last month in our white paper consultation response was really sort of our latest thinking in the regulation space. So we sort of reaffirmed our commitment to that context-based, outcomes-based, principles-based framework. And we sort of set out our next steps on implementation. And that links back to what Robert was saying around how do we actually turn these principles and these statements of policy intent into practice and into delivery. And that's a really, really difficult thing to do, and I'd like to get into that in more detail later. But we also set out how we're iterating our framework and iterating our policy thinking, because one of the fundamental characteristics of our regulatory framework is adaptability. And I think that has to be at the cornerstone of our regulatory approach in the UK. We have to be nimble, we have to be agile and adaptable, otherwise we'll lock in approaches that quickly become outdated. So what we set out last month was some initial thinking on future binding measures on the developers of highly capable general purpose models. Bit of a mouthful, but essentially the developers of these often large language models, but also other kind of highly capable general purpose sophisticated AI models. And I can kind of talk a bit more about that later in terms of what that means for liability, what that means for explainability. But I think it really shows that we're kind of spotting kind of gaps in the framework or new technology on the horizon, and we're thinking actually we need to develop some more policy here, and here's what we're going to do. And we sort of set out that thinking at a high level in the consultation response. So I think to sort of summarize, we're at this stage where we've got a robust statement of policy intent domestically. We've got a real drive to now implement that framework. That's a big, big job, delivering across 90 plus regulators in the UK. We've got our kind of iterative and adaptable policy thinking, where we're looking at the horizon and what's coming and trying to think about how our framework needs to adapt to meet those challenges. And we're also playing a very, very active role in the international debate as well, clearly looking through AI Safety Summit and other multilateral fora and bilateral kind of relationships as well, at how the kind of international landscape is shaping up and where we want to really influence, where we want to achieve interoperability, where we want to kind of like intentionally kind of diverge and have a kind of bespoke and kind of unique approach within the UK. So really, really interesting time, really interesting space, lots more work to come. But yeah, that's a bit of a summary.
Well, that's very helpful, and we're going to come back to a lot of the UK's government response, as well as just broader principles of global governance. But and another question for you, building off of that, which is just, and also what you said earlier, which is, what do financial firms tend to approach you with? What do you see financial firms trying to, leverage IBM or leverage AI generally to do? And then, going back to the governance side of things, and also the panel earlier, what are the risks, especially in terms of things like data privacy and security that you see?
Well, I think the reality of financial institutions, be they in Europe or elsewhere. Now, there'll be some nuances depending on where you sit in the world, but everybody's chasing profitability. So anything that's going to allow firms to do more with less, or have a competitive edge. And it depends, again, on the lines of business. So retail banks, there'll be a lot of interest in generative AI for customer service. If you're in sort of investment banks, algorithmic trading, pushing the frontiers on that. And I think it's one of the things that I like about IBM in terms of the portfolio of capabilities that we have, is that we're able to have almost sort of like a systems thinking approach to it, which is, we were talking about this in the coffee break before we started. Banks need to not just digitize functions, they need to digitize their business models. And having the ability to think, I hate the word, but I can't think of a better one, holistically, about how the reality of the business model needs to translate into decisions around technology to drive outcomes. So it's not about just embedding a chatbot into a customer service function. It's about what are we trying to drive and what is AI contributing to. And the ones that are demonstrating, the firms that are able to demonstrate systems thinking in their ability to embed technology for specific outcomes across the layers of their organization are the ones that I think are going to reap much more benefit and much more sustainable benefit. It's the same type of thinking that's driving better outcomes in terms of operational resilience that Mario Pisani was talking about from Treasury. The ability to think about all of the component parts and what levers have we got to drive different outcomes. So it's being used to drive down cost. It's being used to drive productivity and efficiency. It's being used by the firms that have more vision to drive more delight. And I think this is where, again, we're going to see a differentiation. So retail banks trying to actually deliver services that customers like, as opposed to just thinking about how can we reduce cost. Again, there's so much alignment with the comments from the Microsoft speaker. Outcomes, what are we trying to achieve? And thinking short, medium, long term, and looking at what does it mean in terms of if we implement this, what are we going to get, and then what? So, for example, you could have an immediate benefit of a chatbot that is going to accelerate response times, much more efficiency in that function of the bank, but it changes your risk profile. And how are you then collaborating internally to determine that you have adjusted your risk appetite, the policies, collaborating with your cybersecurity colleagues, and all of those kind of foundational capabilities about how do all of the component functions of the firm work together so that the immediate benefit is reaped, but then the second, third, fourth order effects are also dealt with. And that's where it's challenging. It's not easy, but the thinking is evolving, and I think the policy agenda coming from operational resilience is shifting mindsets, and I think it's helpful in terms of how firms are embracing AI.
So, Robert, just going to you now, I want to ask a question about international cooperation on AI. So what do you view as the role for international governance and cooperation between key stakeholders? What are the limits of it? And how do you assess the current global regulatory AI environment?
Well, that's a big one. I mean, I think I would say, there are many different places are thinking about whether they should have voluntary regulation or they should have actual mandates, and then whether they need to harmonize things at the international level. And if they harmonize things through standards at the international level, then the next question is, do you have some sort of incentives for adopting those standards at the international level? And that's where things get fraught, and people have suggested many different things. The UN High-Level Advisory Board put out what they call an interim report, and that talked about the moment when we should be thinking about that kind of internationalization, where you actually had incentives for compliance, and I think they even used the word maybe they use the word compliance. I don't think they use the word enforcement, but they said that was in a table, and they said that would be greater than 36 months. So that was a view in terms of how difficult that was to achieve, how long it would take to consensus on international standards, and that we probably had to wait a little while before we get there. So I think, you know, when people are thinking about the kind of ambitious areas of international governance, I think it probably is going to take some time. Even the things that seem less ambitious, like, you know, can we consensus on risks through a kind of state of the science report, as the UK has been doing, but maybe that should be something that happens somewhere else, like at the UN, as the IPCC in the climate space does. But even there, that's a very fraught series of discussions. But maybe I would just say that I think there are sort of some sub-areas where things are happening, and I think could be happening, including industry-specific areas. So, you know, right now with regulation on cloud providers is one that I think is particularly interesting, because the executive order in the United States mandates that US cloud providers report things to the US government. And the US government also has put out for comment a series of further specification of what those reporting requirements would look like for infrastructure as a service providers. And it's sort of an attempt to do KYC in the cloud area. And the reaction, I think, of some of the cloud providers is, well, if we really want to do KYC in our area, not just in the finance area, then we need an international architecture to do it. Because if we don't, then it looks like there's some conflicts of law. It's things that we've already been dealing with because of the Cloud Act, and we've had the Schrems cases. So there's this conflict, for instance, between GDPR and some mandates under US law. And that's the last thing that the cloud providers want. And so as a result, there's some, I sense some interest more broadly in, well, how can we have an international agreement that's going to take care of these conflicts of law, harmonize these things, and, you know, maybe that starts with an agreement on reporting requirements, and maybe that looks something like what we have in the finance area, where we have something that's just loosely institutionalized. There are lots of, you all may know this very well, financial intelligence units. There are about 120 or so that cooperate loosely with an organization called the Egmont Group. And that seems to be helpful in finding out who may be trying to get around a regulatory regime. So these sorts of reporting that happen in a kind of loosely organized international regime is the kind of thing that seems a little bit more possible in the short term.
Well, so building off of Robert's point there about incentives, and also thinking globally about countries' incentives and this notion that we're in a kind of AI race, Ellie, I want to kind of come back to you and ask, how do you view the UK's response in terms of its approach toward, you know, fostering innovation on the one hand, while also wanting to make sure that AI is being deployed in a safe way, particularly with respect to the kind of global competition component that, you know, we've pointed to already?
Thanks. Yeah, so I think the philosophy in sort of the UK's regulatory approach is that safety and innovation go hand in hand. So it's by kind of having sensible and appropriate and proportionate guardrails that you can foster innovation in the economy. So that's kind of really core to our approach. They're not mutually exclusive. They, you know, as I say, they need to complement each other. Obviously, what the UK has tried to do is have a kind of flexible, non-statutory regulatory framework at present to remain sort of nimble and agile, and to set out principles for the regulators to interpret. And we really do hope that this does foster innovation across the economy, because regulators can kind of work with their sectors to kind of understand what does good look like here.
Right.
And you've seen some of this with this sort of consumer duty in the finance sector. Let's actually think about what great outcomes look like and have those types of conversations. So we hope it sparks those kinds of conversations. But clearly, as we move from the sort of policy intent phase into delivery, there's lots of work to do for us to for the UK government to sort of support regulators in interpreting the principles and figuring out what that means for them, and also bridging the gap between principles which are very, very high level and quite hard for individual businesses to interpret, and thinking what are the actual practical tools for trustworthy AI that we can develop, the standards, the assurance, the guidance, that actually bridges the gap between that high level policy statement and what businesses can sort of interpret and apply.
Right. Well, on the kind of this notion of, I suppose, AI safety and innovation going hand in hand, it does seem that there's been, two dominant philosophies about AI risk. One that is very accelerationist and focused on kind of a optimistic view of AI's effects, and another that is perhaps more focused on things like catastrophic risk and so on. The UK obviously was facilitating feedback and thoughts on how to get AI policy right for many stakeholders, and I'm curious how you feel you can square those two seemingly disparate groups.
Yeah, I think it was quite interesting, the debate around the summit, so we got quite a lot of feedback from stakeholders saying you're too focused on the frontier, you're too focused on catastrophic risk. We need to focus on the risks of today, and I think I can see why that kind of criticism came up. The summit was a huge kind of moment for the UK. It was kind of really widely reported on. But in the background, we were all kind of scribbling away, working on the AI white paper consultation response. And actually, I think stakeholders were quite pleased and relieved to see in that paper that we're sort of committed to our sort of proportionate framework. We haven't kind of rushed to knee-jerk legislation. I think what the UK is doing well is really balancing the two. So I think our kind of the framework we've set out enables us to address today's risks, because we've already got these regulators out there who are interpreting and applying these principles in their remits. And we're also building the evidence base at the frontier through the AI Safety Institute, through the State of the Science work, through the international cooperation piece. And by building sort of that capability in government and setting up the sort of risk function that we have centrally, we can have that horizon scanning happening. We can kind of be looking down the track and equipping our regulatory framework to adapt to emerging risks. So I think you don't have to have one or the other. We can kind of be looking down the horizon whilst also addressing today's risks. I think that's what the UK is sort of trying to balance, hopefully fairly effectively.
Right. Well, I want to come soon to the question about what to anticipate from the UK's government response. But I want to ask Robert another question. And then also, if you do have questions, we'll come to the audience shortly after. But Robert, on again on this point about international cooperation, if there is this kind of arms race dynamic where countries are competing to lead in artificial intelligence, what do you view as maybe the limits of institution building on a global scale?
Yeah, so I think this is the way that it often gets framed is in terms of a race, and I think it's a little bit helpful to distinguish between the military side of things and the civilian side of things, and both of them obviously involve their own sort of racing. But maybe let's stay with the civilian side of things, because I think that's a focus of most people here. There, I think there's this sort of question, you often hear the frame that regulation is impeding innovation or something like this. And I think there are often precious few real analyses about how much, what the cost is that the regulation is actually imposing in reality. So I think, that's an area where I think we need to sort of have a little bit more analysis so that we're sort of grounded in the real a little bit. My sense is that, there will be some decisions that companies might want to make. There maybe is a product that they want to develop or something they want to release, and they'll want to do that very quickly. And of course, we've been dealing with that forever. That's one of the reasons why we have such a problem with cyber, because companies, before they've really put in place the appropriate safety mitigations, they'd like to rush digital products to market. And so we have, all of us are hacked more as a result of that, and we'd probably like to slow that down. It would be in all of our collective interest to slow that down a little bit. But I think regulation can do that. I guess I think, there are going to be cases where countries are advocating for national champions. We know that has happened. We've watched that happen recently. But on the other hand, the hope is that we can sort of be clear-eyed about where regulation is really imposing costs and where it's actually kind of creating a a playing field that's sort of good for innovation, good for everyone.
Great. Well, now I want to turn to the audience and ask if there are any questions. And we've got a question right here.
Very interesting. Thank you all. I've done a bit of work with the OECD over the last few years. I was one of the drafters of the blockchain policy principles, and now work with the AI Policy Observatory and sort of overlaying the two, right? Thinking about a Web3 framework. And one of the things that we discuss is the role of regulation when mass disruption comes to us. So if you could talk a bit about, so not necessarily the AI safety per se, the super intelligence discussion, but enormous job disruptions. A good friend of mine was managing many billions of dollars and was unceremoniously tinned on Friday with his whole group. So we're seeing it in real time. We're seeing disruption coming in, at least to financial services and knowledge workers in real time. What is the role of government and policy in dealing with those sorts of enormous changes that are projected?
I jump in on that.
Yeah, great.
So if I can just segue via Robert's comments about the regulation of cloud providers, just as an analogy, it's trying to find the balance between collective outcomes and individual firm incentives. So I think that's where there needs to be lots more discussion, lots more debate, lots more uncomfortable conversations. And the reality is that when we're talking about mass disruption, particularly in relation to job displacement, I don't think it's unfair to say that the people typically that are in rooms like this are not typically the demographic that are most likely going to be affected. And it's trying to find the ability to talk about these risks in terms of human impact and what it means on lives and the quality of lives so that it's meaningful and not just very abstract. It's one person who loses a job is a tragedy for that individual, but taken from a macro perspective of an economist, it's a statistic. And the question is, we're gaining, potentially on productivity. There are gains on the metrics that we consider meaningful and important in our economies. The thing is that as our economies change, are we measuring the right things? Are we measuring well-being? Are we measuring the ability of people to live with dignity? I think there's a big question mark about that, but these are some of the most fundamental questions, and it's calling into question the pillars of what we believe to be true. So we implement AI, and my question that I have, to which I have the humility to say I have not got the answer, I wish I did, then what? There is labor displacement and productivity on one dimension, but massive labor displacement and massive fragmentation, dissolution of the fabric of democracy. I don't want to catastrophize, but it's a question of then what? And who picks up the tab? So the accrual of wealth, where is it going? And who has to pay for the collateral impact? And I think these are some of the most challenging things that we are having to face. But my concern is that there is a lack of empathy in those discussions. These are not statistics. They are lives and people. And it could be us. We're just in a position of privilege that distances ourselves a little bit from it.
Yeah, really powerful, and agree with everything you said. And I think, what you're talking about is just, is a massive risk, and the department sort of set up a central risk function that's looking holistically at risks, and looking and working across government and wider on mitigations and preparedness. And some of those mitigations are regulatory, some of them aren't. So there's also other levers that government can pull, right? So in this case, upskilling being a huge one, preparing workers for an AI-enabled workforce, talking to businesses about how to kind of transform responsibly. So I think there's lots of different levers government can pull, and some of the mitigations don't sit with government, they actually sit with the private sector, and there needs to be kind of collaborative joint working on how to address those risks. So there's a big effort to sort of stand up that sort of collaborative risk management process around AI that goes far beyond just sort of regulatory levers. But I think it's an excellent question.
Well, I'll just say that I don't think we know yet whether this is the sort of displacement that we've seen before, or it's something new where we have lots of displacement happening at the same time in lots of different sectors. And so it's that much more challenging for somebody to say, well, here I've lost a position over here, I can go over here, because it's not clear where they're going. And I don't think we know the answer to that yet, but if it does turn out to be of the kind of latter sort, where it's a lot of things happening at the same time, I think we need some new thinking, let's say, to figure out how to deal with that challenge.
Like universal basic income.
It comes down to who's going to pay, right? Ultimately, it's that very sort of somewhat dirty question: who's going to pay? How do we pay? How do we fund it? And I just think what's really interesting is when you take a look at some of the thought leaders or people who are high-profile individuals in this, particularly ones who've exited big tech providers. Their posture on these questions is very interesting. Now, without necessarily saying that they hold the truth, particularly if you don't agree with them, I think it's really interesting to listen to them and wondering what is it that they're seeing that is prompting them to hold the views that they have and prompting them to say, no, I didn't want to be a part of that. Because I'm optimistic about benefits, for sure, but they are dependent and contingent on good critical thinking and choices and a clarity about what we believe matters.
And if I could just ask a follow-up on that question to you, Ellie. Oftentimes, the sort of worker retraining component is very much included in the pamphlet of policy responses to capture those productivity effects. And I'm wondering to what extent you think there's evidence that worker retraining or reskilling has previously worked, and also, what might make this different.
Gosh, so I have to say this is not my area of expertise. This is far out of it, so I'm not sure I can provide a particularly insightful response to this question. I'm not sure I can. Okay. I'm afraid. Skills is not really my remit. I think it's really difficult to do. I mean, I used to work in the labour markets department, so I had a very kind of tangential relationship with the skills system, and I think what's difficult for people when they're kind of reskilling, particularly as an adult, is you have so many kind of personal demands and barriers in your life. You've got to think about your transport, your childcare, your income, you've got all these kind of factors. And when it comes to sort of upskilling and reskilling, people don't just do courses for the sake of it. They need to have a line of sight into a job. They need to know that this course is going to get them that job at that income, so they can support their families. And I think where kind of adult upskilling initiatives have fallen down in the past is where that hasn't been particularly well thought through, when there hasn't been that line of sight into a future career. So I think what the kind of AI upskill, we've put a lot of money into AI upskilling, I know that's for sure. How is it linking people through, though, to the jobs of the future when we're not entirely sure what their jobs will be? Right. So I think that, for me, feels like something we need to really interrogate so that we don't make the similar mistakes of the past. So that's some kind of reflection from previous.
And we do have another question back there. So, yeah.
Michael Borelli, AI and Partners. There's an accusation the EU is going very heavy with their regulatory approach in comparison to the UK's proposed principles-based, outcomes-focused. That being said, there is also thoughts that the UK's approach could allow companies more flexibility. So I would like to ask the question to the panel: do you think that the UK's more flexible approach is more likely to generate good outcomes?
I would prefer to defer. I'll jump in if I may.
I can say something if you prefer to have me. Okay, I'll just say that.
Be honest, it's fine.
I'm definitely going to be honest. I would like to see more than voluntary regulation. I would like to see that. And where the UK is going in this, it seems to me to be an open question. So we'll see. But I don't think, we don't say to the car industry, why don't you think about what safety is and tell us what standards should be, and then, hopefully you can voluntarily comply with them. And so I'm hopeful that I think it's really the role of government to set those standards. I'm hopeful they'll do that.
So if I come back on that, I think the government's approach is, we've set out in the consultation response, legislation will be required, right? So it is the direction of travel we're moving into. But despite that, we don't want to kind of rush into it prematurely. There's a real risk that you kind of move too fast, get it wrong, build something that isn't future-proof, and that very quickly becomes outdated. So it's about sort of making sure that the kind of any binding requirements we introduce in future are kind of really thoughtful. Ideally, you have an empirical basis and are highly targeted at the kind of bits of the life cycle that need that kind of extra layer of kind of accountability. And I think the reason we're pursuing voluntary agreements in the meantime is because they can ideally make the world safer today. So rather than sort of sit back and wait for legislation, which can take some time to get through and then to implement, you can at least start that process through kind of working with companies on best practice and trying to get agreements where you can. And clearly you can't rely on that forever. There'll be periods when that falls down, and we're preparing for that moment. But I think it's the approach that we're taking is let's start with what we have. Let's start with our existing regulators. Let's set some principles. Let's work with companies on a voluntary basis, and let's build that evidence base for the point at which we will need to legislate. So.
Yeah. Just on that, in both contexts, and I think that's where there is that sort of gap that's beginning to be talked about, the area of professional practice, right, the guidelines, so that it gets percolated down the organizations into the actual decisions that are being made in technical teams and how they're coding and what they're building and how they're testing and how they're evaluating their work. And that is voluntary, right? But that's like-minded people getting together because they believe something is important. And it's beginning to build, but I think there is a real, there would be a massive benefit from actually bringing those stakeholder groups together. Typically, you won't find IT architects in the same room as policymakers. It doesn't happen that often. But it's very useful to have a forum where each party starts to understand a bit better where the objective is, the intent, and how it actually shows up in decisions that are being made in agile sprints. Like, all of these things end up in behaviors. They end up either being implemented or not being implemented. And so I said, the IT architects are the last frontier. In a lot of ways they are, because they're the ones that create. And to the extent that we can bring them into the fold a bit more so that the behaviors and the decisions they make when they're designing and implementing actually reflect the spirit and the intent of what we're trying to achieve, it can only be beneficial.
Turning back to, yep, right there.
I wonder if I could ask you to ask us a question, and that would be, are we happier about the prospects of AI and regulation following these two sessions, or unhappier, based on what we've heard?
Well, we can certainly take a show of hands at the end of this panel, so
Yeah,
we'll come back to that.
like that. Thank you.
Miles?
Okay, so I have a question about sort of how content is used. So the New York Times, I think, is currently suing OpenAI, and there's sort of a lot of questions out there about how exactly data is licensed by these models. I know that companies, have started to get into data licensing agreements, I assume for a fee, with companies like OpenAI. And my question is sort of, how can an effective regulatory framework ensure that companies are adequately compensated for their information? And sort of what does transparency mean in this context?
I'd like to take that.
I can make a start.
Yeah, sure.
It's a great question, and it's a topic that is clearly really difficult and contentious. And we kind of said in the white paper response that we've been working really closely with the IPO and the creative industries on this, and haven't found a solution yet, surprisingly. So the work on that continues. But this is perhaps a good time to sort of mention what we're doing to look at sort of binding requirements on the developers of these highly capable general purpose models, because there's a few reasons why we're thinking about kind of binding requirements for this kind of group of developers. It's partly because we don't think they're particularly well captured by our existing framework, and it's partly because the general purpose nature of these models means that kind of a flaw in the system can then be replicated downstream in a number of applications, so they're kind of particularly high risk. And it's also because we want to balance liability more effectively across the life cycle. But one of the things we might be looking at there in that space is around data inputs and transparency measures. So that could include things around kind of copyright and the use of copyrighted material. So haven't quite figured out exactly what that looks like, but it's an area that's being actively looked at as a kind of potential requirement in future for the sort of developers of these kind of highly capable general purpose models. So yeah, difficult question. Haven't entirely got the answer, but it's an area that we're looking at quite closely.
I would just say that that's an area where I think internationalization is particularly important, because we don't want to create kind of havens where people can go or companies can go and create things that can't be done elsewhere. And how you internationalize that is a really interesting question. At a first cut, I would say, states, if they can kind of forbid their markets to that sort of abuse of creative content, for instance, as well as a lot of other things. I think states have a lot of control. If you look at regimes in other areas, like the International Civil Aviation Organization, for instance, there you have an international set of standards, and individual states can forbid their airspace from flights originating from jurisdictions that are violating those standards. So we could do a similar thing like that. We could say we're going to not allow entry into our markets of goods that are produced in a way that we think is violating a set of standards like this. But I think we need to evolve what those standards are going to be.
And I think some of the interesting challenges in this space is some of the solutions to these problems will be technical ones. So it could be sort of certain technical opt-outs. Similarly, with someone mentioned watermarking identifiers earlier as a way of kind of, identifying AI-generated content. Great in practice. The technological solutions to actually do that are still kind of very much being designed, and at the moment they can be easily overridden. So it's interesting that we have these sort of theoretical solutions we're trying to get to, but actually the technology to actually deliver them and make them robust needs to sort of catch up.
Phil?
Just talking about technology, moving conversation on a bit. If AI truly is a next industrial revolution, so it's internal combustion engine, it's electricity, whatever you want to talk it, it is going to be using vast amounts of power to both generate its LLMs and to keep the computers cool while they're working out what these models mean. How do you, as a panel, see that fitting with or conflicting with current commitments to net zero?
Challenging. Yes, absolutely, and it's a topic of discussion. I don't think people have nobody that I've spoken to they haven't resolved it, and it's a question of how do we balance this between the feeling that we have to advance on AI, we have to embed it, we have to get good at it, and we have these regulatory commitments on net zero and ESG targets. They seem, it's like a double bind, sort of damned if we do and damned if we don't. The only thing that I've said from a very tactical perspective is focusing on the use case, right? So what that means in practice is not running a massive LLM when you can run a much smaller targeted one. So it doesn't fix everything. It is a tactical approach that acknowledges the bigger issue, but it is one way of learning by doing, which is understanding very clearly what you are trying to achieve and finding the best tool for the job. So that is one of the things that we would be advising customers on, is trying to find the most appropriate model for the outcome that you're looking for. But that wider question of reconciling the desire to use the technology at scale and not compromise commitments that have already been made, it's a big topic.
I would just say that, it depends on some technological parameters we don't know yet. So we don't know what's going to happen with scaling laws. If scaling laws continue and it's just forever that you can get a lot more capability by just throwing more compute and data and things, then that's going to be sort of sucking ever more more power into doing that. But not everybody agrees that that's what's going to happen. I mean, for instance, Stuart Russell is one who thinks we're likely to plateau in terms of scaling laws. I would just say that on the other side, and this also relates, I think, to a question asked earlier, that the amount of investment into these systems right now, arguably, is more than we're investing in all the rest of science combined. We're really talking about large-scale investments. And, I mean, you think about Sam Altman trying to raise money to do a chip startup. He's trying to raise $7 trillion. I mean, it's almost hard to conceive of the scale that we're talking about. And in a way, so I just wanted to make one quick comment about what was asked before, that if in fact these investments are paying off, I mean, then they have to be capturing a huge share of economic value. And so if we're talking about investments on the scale of $7 trillion that are really being made, I think we want to ask ourselves, do we want one private company to be capturing all of that value? I mean, what should the world look like if we're talking about that sort of concentration of wealth? And how can we think about benefit sharing in that sort of context?
That's great. We have time for one or two more questions before I ask a final question. Yes, right there.
Sorry, again, Michael from Swift. Maybe more of an existential question, and similar to Phil's point about if the possibility for AI is really, really powerful, far more than we'd imagined in the past. The question I had is, when we look at a focus on regulation, and the UK government's looking at maybe being the centre for AI safety and being kind of a hub for that, compared to maybe a focus on being the dominant power in building these models or AI tech, how do we get that balance right? If it looks like it could be an example of nuclear weapon power, where the people who own the technology basically could just ignore regulation and build the regulation themselves. How do we balance that? We look at places like the UAE or Singapore, where they're looking at building their own foundational models. Just an open question. We don't know what the future is, like you said, Rob, so how do we get that balance right?
Yeah, really good question. A difficult one to answer. I don't have the answer. We have a team at the moment who are looking at doing lots of scenario planning, so sort of lots of what does the future look like, what different scenarios could there be, and how do we kind of map how the UK government could play against those. Like, in this kind of world, where does the UK government want to play? Do we want to be building our own model, or do we want to actually be even focusing on this part of the ecosystem? So there's lots of that thinking happening at the moment about actually where do we think the UK wants to pitch itself. But yeah, I couldn't really say like where I think that should be at this stage in time, because as I say, so many uncertainties and so many potential scenarios out there.
Robert, maybe any thoughts from you on that? I mean, in some ways, very similar to the question earlier about institution building and the limits of that when you have a competitive process of AI growth.
Well, again, it depends on these technological parameters. So, it may be kind of natural monopoly or oligopoly or something like that. It's not clear that every country around the world really wants to have the compute locally to build a model at the frontier. I mean, that just may not be the kind of thing that really makes very much sense. And so it seems, sort of more likely that, at least right now, that compute will be localized in some places, that training will happen in those places, and then maybe models will be run because that takes so much less compute in a more disaggregated sort of constellation.
We were talking about this, so again, that the duality between what firms individually want to achieve and maybe the industrial policy of a country. So that point around compute. So typically what we're seeing is that countries are beginning to push for having sovereignty, right, over their data, over their models, but then it has to run somewhere. And there's a dependency then. And it's how do we find the balance between the economies of scale that make the thing viable in terms of compute power, cloud computing power, and then that desire to have autonomy over the model and over the data. And from an operational perspective, what we're seeing is that it gets very difficult to translate the industrial policy into operational decisions at the firm level. And the desirability of different policy outcomes, from digital sovereignty, data sovereignty, progress around innovation, where is the relative balance, and what are you allowed to trade off one over the other? And particularly in the cloud space, fascinating intellectually, but if you happen to be part of a team that is trying to decide where are we going to run our payment system, and are we going to embed AI in that, that gets really, really tricky, because the things that might make sense on paper, it turns out that you can't actually do, particularly if in Europe it's getting very, very difficult. So the translation of policy outcomes and the relative priority, where are they in the pyramid? So, where is resilience in relative terms to sovereignty? And who gets to decide? Because what is tending to happen is that the policy enforcement authorities, they're not the same ones, right? The prudential banking supervisors have a mandate around market integrity, preventing customer harm, financial stability. Data privacy, it's not that they don't care, but it's not as high on their agenda. And banks, however, financial institutions in the private sector, have to satisfy all of their masters. And it just gets very, very difficult trying to figure out, if you're being expected to deliver perfection on everything, but you can't, what are you allowed to trade off? It's not clear, so it will be helpful to have more guidance than that, I think.
We have time for one more quick question. Yeah, Steve?
Mine wasn't really a question, mine was building on that.
Yeah.
Mine was building on that conversation, really, and this is where I see governments playing a part in that regulation. Because if I look back to when we was just starting with cloud and so on, it was like a bit free for all. But then the regulations that governments brought in, I've gone through the Patriot Act and the EU and GDPR, and the big companies do listen and do change their services because of that. Because otherwise, if they don't comply, and therefore they don't sell their services. And so I really do think the governments play a real big part in that regulation and that governance and the compliance. So it's really key. And, I don't think governments will, but I don't think they should ever step away from that responsibility to society.
I want to end with a question for you, Ellie, which is, can you give us a preview of UK AI regulation?
Oh, preview. It's already happening, but I mean, next 6 months maybe. So just sort of break it into sort of 3 buckets. Firstly, lots are happening in the international space. Kind of won't go into that in loads of detail, but obviously we have the next summit coming up in Korea in the coming months. So lots of activity preparing for that. And again, that's going to be focusing on sort of frontier AI and the risks and mitigations in that space. On the domestic side, big challenge on implementation. So we sort of said we would establish some central functions in the white paper that would help bring coherence and coordinate across the regulatory regime. This is really critical to making our framework deliver. Otherwise, there's a real risk of regulatory fragmentation, different approaches across different sectors, etc. So we're doing a lot of thinking at the moment about how do you set that up in a way that meaningfully sparks collaboration and the sharing of best practice across regulators and ensures approaches aren't diverging too significantly. And how do we really support regulators in their roles? It's a new challenge for some regulators who are less mature than others. So what does that all look like? We also announced a £10 million fund to sort of spark innovation in terms of regulatory tools, so kind of launching that. And also consulting on our risk register for AI and our monitoring and evaluation framework. So like really busy on the regulation implementation side. So you'll see a lot of kind of movement and hopefully sort of public outputs in that space in the coming months. And then finally, I sort of mentioned that our framework's adaptable. So doing lots of policy thinking at the moment about kind of the regulation of these highly capable general purpose models. We'll probably have to think about other types of models that are on the horizon in future as well, agentic AI, specialized narrow models. So lots of policy thinking happening over the coming months. And in the white paper response, we set out some questions we wanted to explore. And the reason we did that is because we want to explore them openly. We want to engage with stakeholders and have kind of public conversations about some of these really knotty topics. So lots of policy papers hopefully will be commissioned out or published, or we'll have a sort of roundtables that will kind of summarise and update on publicly to kind of keep the conversation and the policy debate kind of driving forward. So those are sort of my big buckets. Lots on the implementation side, lots on the international engagement piece, and then also lots of kind of iterative policy thinking as we continue to adapt our approach.
Okay, great. Well, we can conclude with the gentleman's request earlier, which is a question back to all of you. So raise your hand if you are more optimistic about the future of AI governance. Okay. And now raise your hand if you are less optimistic about the future of AI. Okay, well, there you have it, not bad. A round of applause for the panelists, everyone. Thank you.